That is to take up again on the theme of the tent of Shem that was introduced at the first and was never again alluded to or developed. I wouldn't mind an opportunity just to sound that a little bit more fully and have the advantage of Bob and others sitting in to interact over that and to give me feedback, because it's a new thought for me, not at all formed. It's very embryonic, but I'm beginning to see something that might be worth our consideration. The indignation of Jesus in the turning over of the money changers' tables in the temple court. We understand it's called the court of the Gentiles, and the indignation that Jesus expressed in an uncommon way violently, grating whips and overturning tables, was that you've made of my Father's house a den of thieves. The house is intended as a house of prayer for all nations. Here's the thing that needs to register on our deepest consciousness. The great redemptive saga of God in the election of Israel is not for Israel's sake per se, but for all nations. Israel is to be the repository. Israel is to be the focal point. Israel is to be the teaching priestly nation. And the nations are drawn to her house as a house of prayer for all nations. So we were touching this before our break, the majesty of God's temple filled with His glory. And at the end of the age, sometimes it's good to look at the end and then work back. In Zechariah chapter 14, when the Lord comes as a deliverer to Israel in her final extremity, in verse 5, the Lord my God will come and all the holy ones with Him. Verse 8, on that day living water shall flow out from Jerusalem. Verse 9, and the Lord will become king over all the earth. And on that day the Lord will be one and His name one. The priestly identity of the Lord, the high priest of our confession, is combined with His royal kingship. He's a priest king. And the place of His domain is Jerusalem, on the holy hill of Zion, on the throne of David, because He Himself is the eternal Son of David, and alone is qualified through that inheritance and descent to be king over Israel forever, and therefore through Israel to all nations. We have to recognize the theocratic intention of God in the whole redemptive drama. Israel is not a thing in itself. And when the disciples, after 40 days of instruction by the resurrected king on those things pertaining to the kingdom, he'd only taught exclusively on that one subject, and it took 40 days. They said to him, is it time now to restore the kingdom to Israel? If ever the Lord had opportunity in one breath to sweep aside some narrow, nationalistic, provincial, tribal jealousy for its own glory, He had it then. But He'd never dismissed the question. He said, it's just not time now to consider that. First, there are other things. Wait in Jerusalem. But the question itself was totally valid, totally biblical, totally within the context of Israel's destiny, and within the understanding of the people of Israel, that they were intended for a kingdom, and as a kingdom to bless all the nations of the earth. And so we see in Zechariah that fulfillment when the Lord will become king over all the earth. And the psalmist sing this out, that His praise shall come to all the ends of the earth. They never were narrow provincial. Their deity was not a tribal deity. He was the God of all the earth, the King of glory, the Creator. And I think that this dimension is lost to the church, and that the kingdom of God has collapsed and has become something inward subjective. The kingdom of God is within. How that statement has been misconstrued, as if it's only a subjective and personal thing, or a kind of a moral standard that the church is to emulate. All of those things have their place, but the ultimate and truest meaning of the kingdom that must be restored to our consciousness, or we will not be capable of the sacrifice for its attainment, is the kingdom as the locus of God's theocratic rule. That's almost a redundancy, because cratic means rule. Democratic, from the Greek demos, means rule by the people. which ain't bad, but it's not ultimate. It'll always be corrupt so long as man brings his corruption to it. But when the king rules, it's the most, what shall we say, just, righteous. There's nothing in it for himself. He's not a professional politician obtaining rules for his own self-aggrandizement. The very nature of the king is for the other. So we need to look to that. Thy kingdom come is the one prayer that Jesus taught the disciples. And we have lost the sense of the kingdom, as the rule of God over his own creation. But the powers of the air know it more profoundly than we. And that's why they will seek the extermination of Jews. Why? Because except that they return to Zion, except that they be a redeemed nation for which the king waits to be enthroned above them, the rule of the nations will continue to reside in the principalities and powers of the air, the rulers of this world's darkness. And Psalm 2 speaks of that. The kings and the rulers take thought against the Lord and against his anointed. They rage. Why? They want to break the bands asunder of the Lord and his anointed. They don't want to see their political control over the nations extinguished. And they know that if his son comes, whom he has established on the holy hill of Zion, they're finished. So what does their wisdom dictate? How do they avoid this terrible calamity of the forfeiture and the end of their own usurping rule? By extinguishing or annihilating those Jews so that they shall not return to Zion. If you don't understand that, you'll not understand the vehemence and the bitterness and the rage that will pursue Jews relentlessly in all nations as the time of Jacob's trouble, right to the end. The Lord will use it, but there'll be a great attrition. But we need to understand what is the nexus of the fury against them by the powers of the air working through unregenerate peoples to extinguish and annihilate this people. And when we look back in history, the Nazi time and every previous time that Jews have narrowly survived, it has been this same animus, the same vehement anger and bitterness against that people to eliminate them entirely. So there'll be no prospect of their return, and hence no prospect of the establishment of that kingdom. It's the kingdom of David. Is it time now to restore the kingdom to Israel? Not yet. But when there is time, it's not a kingdom for Israel. It's a kingdom for the nations. But it has its locus in the place of God's election and choice, the holy hill of Zion. Well, why that, Lord? Certainly there are more impressive locations than that little bump on the log, which is consonant and in keeping with my own character, who is lowly and meek. That's why you'll find two asses tied up in the village yonder. Bring them both. If anyone stops you, tell them that the Lord has need of them. What does he need two for? Well, one is the adult animal, and the other is its foal or its colt. And so what does the Lord do? He dismisses the mature animal and takes that beast upon which never man sat. And he sits on that and comes down the slope of the Mount of Olives. If you've ever been there, you cannot walk down that slope and maintain your dignity. It is too precipitous. But he comes down upon an animal whose legs are unsteady, a full-grown man upon which no man has ever sat. And when the people see that, they shout, Hosanna to the King. And the kingdom must come in the same way as the king, lowly and meek. He chooses the lowly place. He chooses the weak thing. He chooses the foolish thing. He said, I didn't choose you, Israel, because you were mighty and great among the nations. I chose you because you were least. And you'll be least until the time that I shall restore you. You'll be reduced to zero. But then I will exalt you and give you a name above all nations. And all nations will pay homage to you and to the King who has raised you up from being abased to being exalted, for you shall be central to all nations. And so that Deuteronomy 32:8 might be fulfilled, that when God established the number of the nations, he did so in terms of the number of the sons of Israel. A little cryptic verse. Remarkable how those little clues get in there and then are not mentioned again. That from the very beginning of God's redemptive history, I love that German word, Heilsgeschichte. Geschichte in German is history. Heil is salvation. There's a salvation history that is unknown to our American consciousness. The Germans somehow have a greater affinity to see the breadth of God's intention than we. Zechariah 14. What is the end of all this? In verse 16, then all who survive of the nations that have come against Jerusalem shall go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the festival of booths, the Feast of Tabernacles, which is the feast of ingathering. Now the ingathering is from all nations, and that was the intention of that feast from the first. Israel kept it as type, but its fulfillment is when all nations are gathered in to the one place of God's intention, Jerusalem, the city of the great King, to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the festival of booths. If any of the families of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain upon them. And then it describes the judgment that will fall on those Gentile nations who are still intractable, still resentful, and still unwilling to yield to the thing that God has chosen. You have to understand the wisdom of God who knows the hearts of men. And there is such a thing as Gentile pride. And nothing flushes it out and reveals it more acutely than the unwillingness to defer to that nation, to that people whom God has chosen to be at the vortex or the center of His whole kingdom reign. They will still not go up. Or you won't go up? You're still stubbornly refusing the people whom I have chosen? Because your real rebellion is not against them, but against me. But it's revealed in your obstinate refusal to accede to them because you're too proud. You want the kingdom to be at Mount Everest or Geneva or New York City or some such place, and God has chosen this despicable Zion. A shameful, scandalous nation that has blasphemed your name throughout all nations in all history, and yet you will employ that to be the locus of your throne and rule? Yes. Why? Because my kingdom is not of this world. It's not worldly. I don't celebrate what the world celebrates. I have another wisdom. I choose the weak, the lowly, the foolish. And I abase them, but then I exalt them. Not because they're deserving, not because they have any merit in themselves, but because I am that I am. Nothing more reveals God as the I am that I am but the thing that He chooses. Can you see it? How wise of God to choose that one people, that Semitic people, that would make every Japheth nation chafe at the choice. Because each one of them, Germany, France, Great Britain, even Japan, would see themselves as better candidates to be the locus of world rule than that people and that place. That's exactly why they're chosen. So, all of this goes back to this little cryptic reference in Deuteronomy 32:8, that when God determined the number of nations, always with reference to that one nation, and then when Noah pronounced the blessing or the curse, He said, and you, Japheth, shall be enlarged. That's what the very name Japheth means. You will become the technically proficient one in the world. You will establish the economy, the culture, all of the things that constitute civilization, both in its blessing and in its threat. But my provision for you is that you shall dwell in the tent of Shem. You shall come in to the place of God's intention, and there, because you have to bow to enter, something shall be provided for you from that Semitic nation that is called to be priestly and to be dwellers in tents. They are pilgrims, sojourner people. They are never to be established in the world. They are never to be one with the other nations. They have to maintain their distinct spiritual, Davidic, Hebraic, Semitic character, for that is God's very grace for the Japheth nations. Without that, the Japheth nations left to themselves will exalt their enlargement and will compete with one another and rival and fight their wars and bring World War I, World War II, 40 million, 60 million, 80 million, world devastation, unless they are tempered in the one place that will bring the quotient and dimension of God as God, and that people elected to know it, obtain it, and make it known, the Shemite, the Hebrew, the chosen people of God. But you know what the heck of it is? Who is more Japheth today than Israel? Than the present state of Israel? In their technology, in their warfare, in their violence, in the way they conduct themselves, and the way they desire even to be. They want to be like all other Japheth nations. They don't want to be Semitic. They don't want to be pilgrims. They don't want to be the dwellers of the tent and the altar. But God has called them with an irrevocable call. So how is the nation to be instructed into its own call and fulfill its own destiny? By the example given to it by a people called the church, who are drawn out of the nations and whose character has been changed and been made Semitic by its union with its God and by its yieldedness to His Ruach, as to show to Israel what God's own intention for them is. We have to present to Israel a tent which they might enter, so that they might then themselves be the provision of God for all nations, and that all nations will come up to their tent, come up to their Jerusalem, come up to their feast, come up for their instruction. That the Gentiles of 10 nations will clutch the skirt of a Jew and say, take us to your God, for you know Him. You really know Him, because you've learned Him in the school of hard knocks. You've learned Him both in His judgment and in His mercy. Your knowledge of Him is not Talmudic. It's not rabbinical. It's out of the cross. It's out of the suffering, out of walking the very path of your Lord before you on the road to Calvary in your own last day sufferings. You've learned what judgment is, but you've learned also what mercy is. And now you can make Him known in His totality. The saving grace of Japheth is to dwell in the tent of Shem, which he must bow or break to enter. The very act of submitting to God's intention is the very act of humbling. For what rules the nation and corrupts them is their own pride. But you can't enter that tent, let alone dwell in it, unless you bow. But now the problem is, there is no tent for the nations until Israel itself comes into that identity. But how shall they know of it or learn of it, except through the demonstration or the model given by the church itself? That's why Paul said, I'm a man out of time and out of joint. What you see in me is a foretaste or a foreview of God's own calling to my entire nation. I'm the apostle to the Gentiles. What an ironic choice. Shouldn't you have been the apostle to the Jews? Who else has such an exalted rabbinical background as yourself? The chief prize student of Rabbi Gamaliel, and you're made the apostle to the Goyim? And some dumb fisherman has not your credentials, is made the apostle to the circumcision? What kind of logic is that? Perfect. Because Paul has got to be to the Gentile church what the nation Israel will subsequently be to the nations themselves. You remember when Paul called the elders of Ephesus to tell them that you'll see my face no more? You know what manner of man I was with you from the beginning? You know that I didn't lord it over you? You know I didn't look down my Jewish nose in contempt for you as Gentiles? You know that I was a father to you and a mother, and I was with you day and night weeping and from house to house and in every public place, commending the whole counsel of God, and I never sought anything from you? Yes, they know. That was so un-Jewish. That was so un-Pharisaical. It so contradicted everything that Gentiles would associate with Jews. And this Hebrew of the Hebrews did not come to them in the stereotyped expectation of Gentiles. He came to them apostolically. He came to them as a transcendent man from heaven that eclipsed natural identity and brought the very sense of the Lord Himself. So much so that, at least in one case, they were ready to worship Him as God. When He said, you'll see my face no more, and He invited them to pray, they went down on their knees and they hung on His neck and wept. I'm not a sentimental man, but if there's anything that touches me in Scripture, that touches me, because I understand what that means. That Gentiles are not just grateful, well, thanks, brother, you were very faithful, but more than that, what you communicated, what you were for us, right. Your devotion and tireless service without an iota of any kind of racial or religious superiority, that you went under us, you bore us up, you travailed that Christ be formed in us. How shall we ever express our gratitude? You have saved us out of paganism and death, and you've made us Hebraic. You brought us into the tree. We're grafted in by your labors, your proclamation of the gospel, and the example that you were for us. And they hung upon his neck and wept. The reason I'm so touched is not just what is represented in that moment, but can you believe that not too distant a time from now, all the nations that are now foaming at the mouth against Israel will be the same ones that will hang on her neck and weep, that will love her and be grateful for her priestly demonstration and ministry to the Goyim, and that these Jews will perform that without any kind of racial, religious superiority, for we Jews are famous for our superior contempt of the Gentile, and yet we will be like Paul. Paul said, you see in me is a foreshadowing of what the entire nation will be. That's God's intention, and that's how he will reconcile all nations to himself. For Abraham was chosen right after the Tower of Babel was built, and the rebellion of nations to make a name for themselves and to exalt themselves above God. God brought that down and dispersed those nations, and the very next chapter we read that he calls a man out of Ur the Chaldees by the name of Abraham, to begin with him who does not seek a name for himself, to give him a name above every name and a nation above every nation. But it begins with a man's obedience to come out and follow the Lord in the land that he will show him. This is the inception of God's answer to the rebellion of the nations. And Zechariah 14 is the final consummation. All the nations coming up to Jerusalem to worship the God of all the earth. And what we read in Ephesians earlier today is the same thing. In chapter 2 of Ephesians, now therefore you are no more strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and the household of God, and are built upon the foundation, the apostles and prophets. Yeshua HaMashiach himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom all the building fitly framed together grows unto a holy temple of the Lord, in whom you also are built together for the habitation of God through the Spirit. The theme keeps recurring. God is forming something, a tent, a tabernacle, a temple, in order to give the nations a place by which they might pray. My house is a prayer for all nations. We've got to... This is Israel's destiny. This is the church's destiny. That when we will have established this temple, then the Israel who are opposing themselves in their ignorance, the Jews who are the enemies of the gospel, will see the thing to which they are called in what is represented to them by the church that foreshadows it in the temple made of living stones. So the church, Israel, has an apostolate to the nations. But it has got first a glimpse what apostolic is. And that's the reality that we're called to convey, that they might understand and see in us what is their own calling, and that the nations then will have the access to God provided by an Israel that has fulfilled its destiny as the tent of Shem. But if we ourselves, this was my message to Canada, to substantial saints, men with a history, written books and all of these things, but when I suggested to them that the fly in the ointment and the thing in the obstruction that is keeping this from fulfillment is the unwillingness of ourselves as Gentile Christians to humble ourselves and break and bow and enter the tent of Shem. When I gave an invitation to bow and to enter, the outrage, the irritation, the anger, the vexation, as if I was inviting people to another altar and another God. There's something deep, there's something intractable in Gentile pride that nowhere surfaces and is nowhere seen except when the call to the Jew comes. They don't want this association. They don't want this identification. We are an autonomous thing. We are the Israel of God. We are replacement. All of the expressions that the church has taken in isolation from the identification with Israel. And yet the thing that saves Israel in the last days is that very identification. When my servants shall take pity on her stones and have compassion on her dust, the deliverer shall come out of Zion. God waits for something from an essentially Gentile church that has humbled itself to bow and to enter and to come into a relationship, a pathos, sympathy, and identification with that people that is not to be expected of Gentiles. And when we do, then we show to them the very thing to which they are called and must be for the nations. I even went so far as to suggest this very bowing to enter is itself the key to apostolicity. It's remarkable. It will not be found independent of the humbling relationship to which God calls the church to the Jew. That very humbling is the key to apostolic character and to fulfillment. And what we're seeing today in phony apostleship and systems being established by men is in complete absence of an identification or even a consideration of the subject of Israel and the Jew. The thing that I have noticed in the occasions that have been provided, how absent completely any reference to Israel or to the Jew is in those conferences and occasions that are called prophetic. They have nothing to say. It's not part of their consciousness. They are systems builders using the language of apostolicity and propheticness, but missing the genius of it because they omit the key, which is a humbling recognition and identification with the despised people. Because what is the tent of Shem if it is not the character of God? So I'm just playing with this, and I would invite your help. What is this tent of Shem into which Japheth must enter? Is it something just ethnic, racial, Jewish, in any way that we understand that? What is the Semitic root that even precedes Jewish, even precedes Hebrew? Well, Hebrew was not even a word until Abraham, the Semite from Ur the Chaldees, crossed over a river and came into a land that is not dominated by a river rising and falling like the Nile, and is not a great tributary of commerce like the Euphrates or the Tigris, but it's just a little stream called Jordan. And that a man would no longer look down for his sustenance, but look up to the God of the early rain and the latter rain. When you cross over from dependency of looking down to a dependency of looking up, where the rains are not automatic, but relative to your covenant obedience, you're on to it's another ball game. You're on Semitic ground. And Abraham was the man of the tent and the altar. The word tent itself gives the indication of someone who's not fixed and seeing to his own establishment, and it's transient, it's flimsy, it's something that shows another kind of disposition, that your purpose is not your own, and you'll pick up and move that wheresoever the Lord bids. You're not here to acquire property, fame, prestige, all the kinds of things that mark the Gentile world. You're to represent something of an entirely other kind. That's heavenly. And that tent implies contemplation. Isaac was a man of the tent. It's a place where you go in to find a time with God away from distraction. It's a place to meditate, to consider the Lord. It's a place of simplicity. It's a place of humility. It's a place of innocence. And I picked up on the word innocence as Bob used it last night, and I asked him privately when the meeting was over, I said, what do you mean by innocence? Because innocence we usually attribute to children. They're innocent because they've never been exposed. And they go through life, they trust anyone, and you can give them a lollipop and take them into a car and rape and kill them. They're so innocent, they don't know evil. But the innocence of the Semite and the dweller of the tent, that alone makes the reception of Japheth a redemptive thing, is an innocence that does not come from ignorance, but comes through exposure. Jesus knew what was in man, but it did not make him cynical. He knew exactly what was in man and would not trust himself to them, but it never made him cynical, caustic, wise-alecky, condemning. There's an innocence that is better than the innocence of children. It's the innocence of those who have seen evil, have themselves been involved in evil, and have been saved out of evil, and have transcended evil, and have come to a quality of purity as if they had never touched it. It's not an innocence that you obtain because you have been shielded, and we've lived in glass houses. But those that are in the world, not of the world, know its realities, know its truths, but yet have maintained a certain disposition of character that can be called innocence in the most profound sense. I'm trying to identify this 10th of Shem, Oswald Chambers. Because when you said the word utter, immediately I was reminded, I've not read this in anyone else, but Chambers occasionally uses the phrase, an utterness toward God. Watchman Nee, a Chinese believer, the last that you would expect, he's not even descendant from Shem, also uses the phrase, an utterness toward God. Think on that. This utterness has only one perspective, the glory of God. It has only one jealousy. It has only one constraint. It has only one principle. It's rooted in a God consciousness, utterness toward God. That's the 10th of Shem. What is the consciousness of Japheth? My glory, my honor, my name, my exaltation, my prestige, my fame, my wealth, my power. They've got to come into a place that is a total contradiction to the false principle by which the world lives its life and dies. And it's got to be not just pronounced by men, but exemplified and shown by those who are authentically submitted, whether they're born in China or born in Scotland. That's what God is after. But it's going to take a crisis for us to come through to that kind of faith, because our present Christianity is far too gentilic, far too prestige-minded, far too concerned for fame, for the establishment of our ministry, our this, our that, and not enough of this utterness toward God. So there's a bowing and a breaking and an entering into the dimension where God will alone meet us. This is the genius of Shem, and it's available to every man regardless of his natural descent, and made all the more glorious because it is not the issue of natural descent. And as I said to that Canadian audience, I have no more advantage than you. The fact that I'm born Jewish does not equip me. I've got to come the same way into Shemite consciousness and reality as you through the operation of the cross and separation unto God and union with Him. It's not an issue of what is natural. It's an issue of what is supernatural. But unless we seek it, unless we're conscious of it, unless we understand what the distinctive of the church must be, or Israel itself cannot be moved to jealousy, how shall we obtain it? We need to recognize those things that are Gentile. I hope that you've not flinched every time I've used that word in these days. I'm not pointing at that natural designation. I'm pointing at a mentality, a Greek mode of being, an exaltation of certain values that are contrary to God. To be Semitic is to be heavenly. And the great Semite is Jesus Himself. And when you read of His walk and talk, He doesn't at all come through Jewishly. He comes through transcendently. Something above what is understood as Jewish piety. In fact, He's even a contradiction to that piety, and for which reason He was so dangerous that it evoked His death. Present Jewish thing is totally Japheth. Totally power-minded, totally prestige-minded. They win the awards, the Nobel Prizes, they establish power, they're the high-tech civilization of the Middle East, they emphasize military force, nuclear capability. It's totally a Japheth mentality. How shall they glimpse what is their own calling, except they see it made manifest where they least expect to find it, in Gentiles who have come into a Shem-like identity. Peter himself exhibits this gentilic mentality when after the Father has spoken, "This is my Son in whom I'm well pleased," let us build 3 booths. He wants to make permanent. He wants to manifest monumentally. That's typically gentilic, typically Japheth. He himself had to become Semitic by the power of the Spirit and the conversion that came by his own betrayal of Christ. It took that character of radical coming to his end in order to be the Semite, which is the root of his apostlness or apostolicity. And the same thing for us. For Paul never explains how it is that they are to be moved to jealousy. What is it that they need to see that they don't already have, and have yet more superbly than ourselves. Their services, their buildings, their synagogues, their rabbis, their erudition, their Hebrew, their liturgy leaves us in the shade. We're creaking and groaning like a putt-putt next to the kind of magistry that they have in their religious realm. So we're not going to make them jealous in that way. What do they need to see? The genius of God's intention for them. That will be the very salvation for the nations of the world. Why will 10 Gentiles clutch the skirt of a Jew? Because he's got something to communicate, and is already giving such evidence of it that these Gentile nations know that unless they obtain it from them, they themselves are lost to their own Gentileness, which has always been in the last analysis: war, destruction, mayhem, and collapse. The man of the tent is a moral man. And when I was in Albania, and they had me to speak to the teachers and administrators of the high school that this Christian group had founded, the word that the Lord gave me was to these teachers: don't you know that your vocation as teachers is a moral vocation? Are you bringing a moral quotient into your classroom through your subject matter? They didn't even know what I was talking about. I was the Jew, I was the Hebrew, talking about a dimension of consciousness that was unknown to them. And it took some elaboration. I don't know to what degree it succeeded. What does this word moral mean? This issue of a sense of rightness, of what is just, what is merciful, what is true, what reflects God. You mean you can communicate that through secular subject matter? Not only can you, but if you don't, you really fail as a teacher. For teaching is a noble vocation, and the object of it is not the mere communication of earthly information, but the communication of a moral quotient that will awaken in your students a sensibility to begin to think in terms of good and bad, evil, right and wrong. How shall I walk? How shall I live? The man of the tent is steeped in that kind of consideration. Not what works, not what is expedient, not what is practical, not what will be the payoff. What is moral? What is truth? What is righteous? That's the man of the tent, and that's a saving grace for the world if Israel will come into her identity and be it for the nations. But it will not be except for us. Our example, our model, our moving into jealousy in this very thing. And that's the pathos that God, I think, was getting at, that we should have an identification, a sense of the terrible tragedy of the failure of my people to fulfill their own destiny and to be to the world a nation of priests and a light unto the world. When I preach this, I say to wherever I am, do you realize how substandard our life is in the world? Do you realize what room we have made for the things that are profane, ugly, crippling, sexually abased, degrading, immoral? That we're celebrating rap singers whose language is so unbelievably filthy toward women, toward mothers, and they're selling by the millions and the billions. Middle-class white kids with their things glued to their ears listening to this filth and celebrating these men who have barren fortunes, and Jewish men who are in the business of promoting that, quote, music. The world is degraded. It's profane, it's defiled, it's a Sodom and Gomorrah hell for the want of a presence in the earth that will teach the people the difference between the sacred and the profane. The Shemite. Not some legalism, but something exuding, something that only can be communicated in a priestly way, that cannot be communicated if you have any kind of sense of superiority, or you look with any contempt upon the peoples, as is presently true of most Jews. My mother used to spit out the word the Goyim. When she lived in West Palm Beach, Florida, and had to go to the supermarket, and some freckle-faced, snot-nosed kid was at the cash register, cracking gum, and was harassing my mother because she was aged and slow, or she was fumbling with her purse to get out her pennies in a way everything is conserved, and this little girl had no patience for it. My mother would tell me, to go him, them, the other. That has been the historic temper of most Jews through the ages. How then shall we be to them a nation of priests and a light unto the world, except that we have taken on the character of the greatest son of Shem, Jesus himself? Unless that that image has been demonstrated to us corporately, collectively, by that which we have despised called the church. So this is what the Lord is after. It's ultimate. It's mentioned at the first, and it concludes at the end. In this ingathering, in the Feast of Tabernacles, when nations shall be called up to acknowledge God and to praise Him. Psalm 46 concludes, I will be exalted among the heathen. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. I love that because in the humility of God, He's not ashamed to identify Himself with the name of the usurper and the schemer. Though He becomes Israel, God yet refers to Himself as Jacob's God. Because He was Jacob's God while he was yet usurping, and while he was yet a schemer, and while he was yet not in the right relationship with his God as were her fathers before him. Yet God was his God. There was an identification of pathos. We need to sense the tragedy, the historic tragedy of the failure of Israel to be Israel, of the continuation of this people in a Japheth mentality that has cheated the world of the benevolence that would have come as God's intention for this nation in a priestly way to teach the world the difference between the sacred and profane. The world has lost immeasurably, and I have a sneaky suspicion, it's only a subjective fancy, that the root of anti-Semitism is the sense in Gentiles that it is intuitive that this people have failed us, have failed to be to us what somehow was intended, and therefore we're suffering in our suffocating Gentilism and power and lust and ambition from which we would have been saved if Israel had only been Israel. There's got to be a sense of pathos for the loss, for the failure, for the tragic collapse of this people, for the rejection of their own Messiah, for their long apostasy. And because we have that identification, that, I've lost the word now. Pathos. So also will be the key of their return. We ourselves need to come to them in a priestly way, and not in a superior way. We need to come under them in their sin and in their shame and scandal, not holding ourselves at a distance and condemning them, but joining them. As Jesus himself entered the waters of baptism, not because he was a sinner, but because it befitted all righteousness that he should identify with his own nation in its sin. He didn't just stand on the bank and watch them go down into the muddy water. He himself went down. And when the Father saw that, he said, "This is my Son, in whom I am well pleased." What he has done is what I am. I go down, I identify, and I'm waiting for a church that will also go down and identify with Israel. Not when it's cute, not when it's successful, when it is shameful, when it's scandalous, when it's failed, when it's apostate, when it will be even suffering degrading judgment. Those that will have compassion for her stones and mercy upon her dust will release me to be to them a deliverer. For my people, my servants, will have come of age through their very relatedness with Israel itself in her sin. While they're yet sinners, they're your brethren. So Lord, we acknowledge that we're so removed from this consciousness, let alone this reality. And yet you're raising something for us, a consideration of a new kind that is an old consideration and that was given at the first. In the mystery of God through the prophet Noah, Japheth shall be enlarged. But rather than he should be left to his enlargement, which shall be destructive equally as it can be blessing, I call him to dwell in the tent of Shem. But if there's no tent, if there's no Shem, that's Shem. To what shall the Japheth nations repair, but to a Sodom and Gomorrah destiny of a spiraling downward and out. So Lord, what a call to the church, that you have called out of the nations, a people for your name from all nations, but to come into an identity above what is natural, above what is ethnic, above what is generic and racial, and take the character of the very Lord himself. Help us to that, Lord, by pathos, by sympathy, by identification, by seeking out a communion with that people whom we have avoided and who are strange to us and intimidate us, and we're afraid to even visit their synagogues and to show up. We don't know how to relate. And yet we talk about grace. Where is it when it's needed? With the people who look equally upon us with suspicion as Christians. They're equally as averse to us as we have historically been to them. Something needs to break in and break through, Lord.
Yes.
And so we ask mercy, grace, Lord, love, wisdom, understanding, desire to fulfill the mystery of the church itself. And in that fulfillment, to defeat the powers of the air who say there's no way that Gentiles will ever be able to extend themselves for another, especially Jews. Because the principle of this life is take care of number one. See to your own security. See to your own well-being. Why should you extend yourself for them and put your head in the noose? You're going to go to a concentration camp because you took some Jews in who were wandering and broken in their flight? So, my God, have a bride for the bridegroom. Have a people for your name. Have a wife who is a Shemite and not some thinly Christianized Gentile. Work the deeps, my God, of the whole Hebraic faith into us, my God. And not that it should be some cutesy little addendum that we have adopted as Jewish roots, but come and be our very nature, the dwellers in the tent, the people who wait, the people who live in the rest of God, the people who wait for the moving of the Spirit that goes where it will and you cannot know, and the people who do not need to know. Thank you, my God. Help us with a little help, whether we're Jews by birth or Gentiles, to come into that ultimate designation that fulfills the mystery of God, that comes through your grace and the power of the cross, the blood and the work of your Spirit and Word. And for that we thank you and give you the praise in Jesus' name. Amen.